Hey guys, how's it going? I'm going to share with you more notes from Christ of the Covenants, The Christ of the Covenants by O. Palmer Robertson. And so I went over Noah, the covenant of preservation, the covenant that God made to Noah, and took some notes, not as much as some of the other ones, but about a page and a half or so. And so this is continuing from the Adamic covenant, the covenant that God made with Adam, and the covenant that God made with Adam, and basically we read about how Satan's seed will be at war with the seed of the woman, and for Satan's seed there's destruction, for the woman's seed there's redemptive grace. And we read some comparisons in Genesis 6, chapter 6, verse 17 through 22, chapter 8, verse 20 through 22, chapter 9, verse 1 through 7, and verse 8 through 17. In Genesis chapter 6, 17 through 22, it talks about all the birds and the cattle and the creeping things, and that's a call back to the covenant of creation. And the Genesis chapter 9, verse 1 through 7 talks about being fruitful and multiplying. It's a call back to the covenant of creation also. And so there's a relation between the covenant and redemptive covenants, the creation and the covenant of creation, the covenant of redemption, and this covenant must be viewed on redemptive terms, the covenant of Noah. And so the fact that God is preserving the earth and such, and the animals in the covenant of Noah, also serves a purpose for redemption of man, and redemption in total, that God is seeking, the covenant of redemption. And so we think of redemption not in just terms of soul salvation, but also of the earth and the animals, how preserving them leads to the fulfillment of the covenant of redemption, basically, I guess. So these are some notes on the covenant of preservation. And so the covenant with Adam was the covenant of commencement. So we're commencing forth, after the fall, commencing with the covenant of redemption and preservation, because obviously God destroyed, the world with the flood, and he preserved Noah and his family and all the animals in the ark. And so preserving his people to go forth. And so these are notes on the covenant of Noah. The first one, he mentioned how relation to creation and redemption covenants. And then God's grace towards Noah. And God deals with families in his covenant relationships in Genesis chapter 6, verse 18. Genesis chapter 7, verse 1. Because Noah was righteous, his family was delivered from the flood. And so we see this principle of, whoever follows God has God's grace, and that covers their family as well. So we also see that God preserves the earth in Genesis chapter 8, verse 20 through 22. The flood is used as an example of final judgment, and some of the purpose of the flood, just to preserve God's people and everything, but it's also used as an example of final judgment and for refuting scoffers. We read about in 2 Peter chapter 3, verse 4 through 6. God preserves man also, Genesis chapter 9, verses 3 through 6. And then he has a pretty big section on capital punishment, how God said to Noah that any man who kills people basically should be killed himself. So this institution of capital punishment is put in place. He talks about how earlier before this, God reserved himself to deal with the manslayer Cain. He said basically that no one is to touch Cain, even though Cain was a murderer. And he now gives this responsibility to man to deal with this, to deal with murderers. We read about this in Genesis 9, chapter 9, verse 5 and 6. And then there's also reference to it in Ezekiel 33, verse 6, and Ezekiel 34, verse 10. And in Exodus 21:28, it talks about an animal's life is taken by man. Any animal that kills a man is to be killed by man also. And we read about that in Exodus 21:12 and Numbers 35:16 through 21. It says that capital punishment originated with humanity's new beginning with the family of Noah. So this is when and why basically capital punishment came into place, that God, cleared the earth of all the evildoers, preserved Noah and his family. And so going forth, they were to keep this, that if any man is a murderer, that he has killed himself. And he talks about how it relates to the New Testament, the New Covenant, basically, that now capital punishment is, our power is granted to the state, he says in Romans 13:1 and 1 Peter 2:13 and 14. And so there's lots of other interesting things that he said that I didn't take notes on. It's stuff that, I got to think about more and look at and stuff. But he talks about basically how, first of all, capital punishment, to keep that was not specific to any ethnicity or anything like that. It was God's command basically for all people, and then talking about how the old covenant with the new, how that relates. And he said that basically, like, under the Mosaic law or something, they weren't supposed to eat certain types of animals, but then in the New Testament, Paul says that any animal is clean, basically. Everything belongs to the Lord and stuff. And so how that kind of relates to capital punishment. But basically, ultimately, I think he just says that, his belief is that now the power is given to the state, and so the lawmakers and stuff, they decide man's punishment. But, so the next big note on the covenant of Noah is a universalistic aspect, and that every living creature lives under the sign of the rainbow. Genesis chapter 9, verse 10, Romans 8:22. And then we read in Psalm 19:2 through 4, and Romans 10:18. He talks about how this pertains to the gospel. The gospel is preached to all nations, and we read in Romans 10:12. And so this affects, every living creature, basically. It's a witness to all creation, and so the gospel also kind of fulfills that, how it's to be preached to all nations. He talks about the rainbow, emphasizes God's grace, and the rainbow is the seal of the covenant to Noah. And earlier, at the very beginning, I talked about how he was trying to define covenant, what a covenant is, and he talks about how a covenant is like a contract, or maybe he didn't say that. He said something about how it's made in life or death. Let me see in my notes if I can go back to where he said. He said it's a bond in blood, sovereignly administered. That's what he says. And in bond in blood, he means life and death. So it has these aspects of life and death. And there was that aspect as far as the evil men being destroyed in the flood and Noah being saved. There was judgment upon, the evildoers, the ones who weren't followers of God. But then also there's life or death in the aspect of how there is death to any murderer. And so when a person murders another person, they're breaking this covenant. And so they're a covenant breaker, and the covenant breaker is to be killed. So there's that life and death aspect there. So it's interesting stuff, but basically, just I mean, it's kind of obvious, but Noah, the covenant to Noah, is one of preservation, and so he's preserving his people and the animals and everything else. So it's continuing forth in this covenant of redemption and bringing it to realization. And so, yeah, the next one will be the covenant to Abraham, and then he has a section on the seal of Abraham. And then I got Moses, and then I got David, and then Christ, I believe. So going through this, probably getting close to being halfway through this. And then he has the section in there between dispensationalism and covenant theology, which I've already kind of went over. I might skip that and go through the other ones and then go back through it. But I'm basically just trying to work my way through this book now. But yeah, getting through it. So that's that. God bless.